Hello, everybody, and welcome to Common Censored. I'm Lee Camp, here as always with Eleanor Goldfield.
Hello, hello.
And this is the show where we talk censored stories and people, sensible solutions, and common ground movements to fight and build.
And sometimes other stuff.
And along with other podcasts, we are on the Popular Resistance Podcast Network, so you can grab all of them over at popularresistance.org. And anyway, we got a lot to talk about. We got a lot to get into. I'm rather than giving topics this time, I'm going to start with France. Let's talk about how France is popping off.
Yeah, so, I mean, as we record this, it's Sunday, December 8th, so things will likely progress and new information will materialize in the week starting on Monday the 9th. But as of last, or really yesterday, the 7th, these are the biggest strikes. Strikes have swept the entire country of France. Nearly 1 million people across the entire nation have gone on strike. It's the biggest strikes since 1995, when 3 weeks of huge work stoppages basically forced a social policy U-turn by the then French government. And really, the bottom line here is that the French know how to get shit done.
Well, they definitely know how to protest more than we do. But the reason these are particularly interesting is it's so many disparate groups coming together.
Right. And I found this really interesting because this is, and I talk about this briefly in this coming week's episode of Act Out, and it's something that's been covered on a couple of different outlets. But these points, these intersections that are vital points for either solidarity or for division. And I feel like so often those points, those intersection points, are points of division here in the United States. But in places like France, we see them as points of solidarity. So for instance, you've got folks coming from the Yellow Vest movement. Of course, you have folks coming from Extinction Rebellion. You have anarchists, kind of like the Black Bloc section. And then you have, centrists. You have people that have been, kind of diligent workers their entire lives that are just now spilling that frustration from the home and workplace out into the streets, that are coming together in particular with regards to Macron's neoliberal pension policy. And folks might remember from several years ago, I can't remember exactly which year this was, but there were big protests with around the airline industry and pensions that were being cut there. And
those were some of my favorite because the CEO, they chased the CEO across the tarmac, and then they ended up ripping off his shirt as he tried to climb over a fence. So there's this incredible video of the CEO of the company like with his shirt ripped off.
Right. And another one of I remember this sign very clearly from those protests, and it said, "A worker without a pension is an American." And I was like, oh, burn. But also, yes. So, folks, remember, the French might be rude, but they're oftentimes right.
But this is something that Americans should very much learn, which is different groups coming together to fight for change, because we are so good at divide and conquer. I mean, it's like we do the work of the government forces or the FBI and the CIA sometimes at times working to stop protest. We kind of do the work for them by just hating each other for having slight differences.
Yeah, and I think this is also an amazing show of what happens when the workers organizing both in the workplace and, in community places realize our power, right? Because France is grinding to a halt, particularly around the holidays. People need the transportation industries and all of these industries that are particularly so vital around this quote unquote high point of consumption around the holidays. Our power is, magnificent if we choose to take a hold of it and really use that as the ultimate bargaining chip for our basic rights. And folks might think, oh, you're, quote unquote, working a bit longer in your life is not that big of a deal. Americans do that already. And it's like, yes, but we've been programmed to think that it's okay to work until you're 85 and can barely stand, right? And French workers are saying, no, that's not okay. That we want to have these basic human rights that were really fought for by the labor movement many years ago, when the 8-hour workday came about, and the 40-hour work week, so we're not working on the weekends. These are ideas that have kind of slowly been cut away in the American paradigm, but that are still very present in the French workplace and in the French paradigm. And so these are things that definitely should be brought back into the United States paradigm for our workplaces.
Yeah, and all of these things took long-standing fights. I know we've talked about it before, but all of the gains of workers, it wasn't easy. They didn't knock on the door of the White House and say, "Excuse us, we'd like a weekend, and we'd like to not have children running around the workplace."
Right.
We no child labor and things like that. Like, all of that took big fights. And now many of those rights, like you said very correctly, have been eroded in many ways, even claiming that, a lot of workers don't have the right to strike. But striking shouldn't be a right that's given by the government. It should be something you demand.
Right. And it's not. And if it's not, then it is something that they can take away from you. And it's very important that we not lose sight of that. And I'm going to kind of butcher the quote, but Emma Goldman, who's the famous American anarchist, said in a speech, which she was then promptly arrested for saying this: ask for work. If they don't give you work, ask for bread. And if they don't give you bread, take bread. And it's this idea that you can keep asking, right? And incidentally, in the U.S., they are taking bread now. There's a new plan that will cut food stamps for some 700,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
They're literally taking bread at this point. And then the question becomes, at what point do we say, you know what, you have nothing, you can't take blood from a rock, and we're going to organize and take hold of that power that we have as these workers.
I talked a little bit about the food stamp issue on the redacted pre-show that I've started putting on YouTube, which is when I go over some headlines with the audience before the show gets started. And they're the Trump administration is kicking 700,000 people off of food stamps via harsher work requirements. But those are the people that collect the food stamps. So that does not count the children that are benefiting from these food stamps, many of them. So they're estimating it's easily over 1 million kids will lose some percentage of their food each month. And I just love the idea of, they're sitting around in an office, the Trump administration, and, God knows how many Democrats in Congress support this shit, which is probably a lot of them. But I love the idea of them sitting around and being like, well, let's see, the oceans are acidifying. We're 2 minutes to midnight on the nuclear clock. But we really got to stop these kids from eating. I mean, they are just collecting so much of this food in their faces, and this is poor people taking food that the rich could be eating, and
right.
We really got to fix that.
Well, and I go into more detail in this in this week's episode of my show Act Out, which comes out on Wednesday. All
right, just rub it in. You get more detail on your show. Yeah.
I don't have the luxury of a pre-show. There's this argument, which is always the argument. Oh, this is going to save $5.5 billion over the course of 5 years. And one of the examples that I use is that based on 2019's military budget, and that's the announced military budget, which is $716 billion, in 1 week of the announced military budget, we spend more than $13 billion. So you're telling me that by starving people, you're going to save $5.5 billion over 5 years, when in a half a week, actually basically 3 days, you could save that amount of money by not bombing people. So I mean,
that's what the Pentagon spends on a couple of Pentagon toilet seats.
Basically, yeah, on the all-you-can-eat buffets for their entire staff. So. Yeah, this is not about that, and this is why it's kind of looping back to France. Not that France is perfect or anything like that, but there's a lot to be learned from any sort of protest movement, and I think that it's vital that we look to them in these moments to see, wow, this is really in these moments when so much is being taken from us. It's a really important time to meet at those intersections and see where we can build solidarity as opposed to where we can be divided and conquered.
One more note on the food stamps is I also love the idea that this doesn't, it's going to save $5.5 billion over 5 years. So we got to do it for those savings, as if taking food from the hungry in this country doesn't have any other repercussions.
Right.
You know, as if fucking people being hungrier and needier and struggling more doesn't have any other repercussions, you know, like more of them ending up in the prison system or more of them needing medical care or more of the children, because guess what? Children that are hungry have a lot of trouble learning in schools, so they end up having much more difficult lives and can't get the education they need and things like that. So, I'm sure that $5 billion savings is really just going to go straight into the bank. There won't be any other repercussions.
No. It goes straight to Bezos and his tax credits.
Yeah. So speaking of because we were talking earlier about the jobs and workers standing up, the U.S. has added, and this is the big bragging point of the Trump administration, the U.S. added 266,000 jobs in November, and unemployment in America is at a 50-year low. Now, you and I have talked multiple times on this podcast about how ridiculous these numbers are. Workers are more exploited than ever before. People are working multiple jobs. It's not the unemployment numbers, not counting the people that have stopped looking for work. You know, we don't have to go through all of that again, but something that maybe I feel like I don't discuss enough or is not discussed enough is the fact that it's pretty insane that we all think that everybody should have to be like even just working kind of endlessly. I don't even mean like, I realize not everybody feels they're enslaved. Not everybody feels like they're working grueling hours, but just the idea that in order to survive, you have to have this certain number of working hours.
Well, that your value as a human being is tied to your ability to labor, which is
right.
Just a really sick, you're like, your value is based on how much money you take in every month.
Well, and so you get a little philosophical and you go, well, what is the work going towards? And it's like, back years ago, it used to be 80% of our effort in the country, in the 1800s or something, was spent towards creating, harvesting, and prepping food. And now we've gotten that down to like 1 or 2% of the effort in this country is about making and prepping food. So now we have the other 98% of our time, our efforts, and yet we're working equally hard for what? If it's not, I'm talking about people that are not working at their passion, doing the thing they love every day of the week, which is most of America. Mm-hmm. So philosophically, why is it we have created a system where it's like people just have to work endlessly?
Yeah, and that you don't have that time of leisure. And this is something that people talk about with automation, like, oh, it's a great thing. And I'm not a Luddite over here, but I think that what would make it great is the same thing that could have made what you're talking about great, which is if the gains of not having to work for our basic needs would have been shared equally, then people wouldn't have to work at menial jobs that they fucking hate, and they could spend more time doing whatever they wanted, which, if that's macrameing or whatever the fuck else it is that you do, I don't even know, but like whatever it is that gets you off and floats your boat. I mean, that's the idea behind automation and having these systems and this technology to be able to take up the work that we don't want to do.
Right, and there was a time I think a lot of it was in the 70s, where a lot of the kind of great thinkers and the bigger thinkers of the day were saying we all need to prepare for a leisure society. They were like, because they could see where automation was going, and they didn't have advanced computers yet, but they knew that things would get there. And they were like, all of our jobs are going to be taken away by various kinds of computers or things like that. And we're going to get to a point in the next, 30, 40 years where most of our lives is leisure. And they didn't realize that we are so fucking dumb that we are going to just allow ourselves to be exploited in like all new ways throughout our entire lives.
And what does that have to do with the jobs posting for November, Lee?
Well, it has to do with the fact that we celebrate these jobs numbers, and we talk about how, and this is the number one. If you had to list the reasons that Trump may get reelected, and we've gone on about how the impeachment is going to probably hurt the Democrats and things like that, but and undermining the DNC, undermining Bernie Sanders and shit like that, but I'd say the number one reason that Trump may get reelected is simply that these jobs numbers are quote unquote doing well, because we have all tricked ourselves, and some could argue it's intentional, some could argue it's unintentional, it's just within our culture, to think that if everybody's working, then that means the society is successful. But if you think about it in a more philosophical sense, what the fuck are we all working towards?
Well, and not only that, but as we've talked also about on the show, is that these jobs don't mean that they're the kind of jobs that are even good for the economy, even in a kind of like just stark capitalistic sense, right? Because they're not jobs that give people the ability to be financially secure enough to then feed back into the economy, right? Like that's the whole point of things like the New Deal. The idea was, well, how can we boost the economy by giving people jobs so that they can be part of the economy by buying goods and buying a house and having extra money to spend at the fucking movie theater or whatever. Like that's the whole point. But when everybody works in like the gig economy, they don't have all of their savings and then some goes to fixing that root canal or whatever. Like there's no money to be spent back into the economy. So these jobs, they're not really jobs. They're like temporary cash flows that end up going straight back into student loans or straight back into healthcare or rent, which is ridiculously high in basically every U.S. city. So it's like these aren't jobs that suggest a healthy economy. It's a very sick economy that's going to collapse.
Well, and the GDP in general, and I know we've hit on this before too, it's just how much can you produce and build and extract. It's like that's what GDP is, and that's how we monitor our success as a country against other countries. So we're all just fighting over who can consume the most and plow through the most shit and buy the most shit. And really, we should have an economy that actually measures many other things. Mm-hmm. And of course, we've talked about Bhutan with their gross domestic happiness, but it's that idea that like we're almost all the countries are measuring their success by how much we extract materials and consume shit. And that's why you have China building ghost cities that no one lives in, because the building process, making the buildings, is good for GDP.
Right. And of course, the other side of that is the fact that income inequality might look good on a spreadsheet where it says like, oh, this is how much money exists in the economy. Yeah, but if it's owned by 4 dudes, that doesn't do your economy a shit bit of good.
Fucking dudes. They're the worst.
Aren't they, though? How about some good news?
So, yeah. How about some good news real quick before we go through some housekeeping stuff? We told you before a few weeks ago about, he's a friend of ours, but he's also a great journalist named Max Blumenthal, and he was arrested with a SWAT team at his house in D.C. for false assault charges that were 5 months old. The false charges were 5 months old. And it was just a ridiculous scenario that seemed very clearly designed to get him to stop reporting or at least be so stressed and dealing with lawsuits and things that he's unable to report on the revelations about U.S. creating coups in Latin America, Venezuela specifically. And anyway, the good news is those charges have been dropped. He announced the other day that they were utterly ridiculous charges, and ultimately the judge, I guess, realized they were fucking stupid. But this is what you deal with. This is what a lot of our people, activists that we support, and they're dealing with things like this. Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers are dealing with some similar stuff, and the cops tried to arrest Medea Benjamin from Code Pink the other day on a very similar scenario. And all of this is just meant to stop activists and journalists that are outside the mainstream, that are not on CNN every day, from doing their work, from doing what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also reminded of something that Mike Africa Jr. told me, which I think I've mentioned before. He's part of the Move organization. I mean, if you haven't heard of the Move 9, I definitely suggest that you take a look at it. But he told me that, one of the things that this does, it's a waste of time. When you're working on freeing the revolutionary, that you're not working on the revolution, is what he said. So this is part of it too. Like, even if they know going into it that these charges are going to be dropped, that they're totally bogus, that it's fucking stupid, they'll do it anyway because, hey, you can't really do much while you're sitting in jail and not allowed a phone call or to talk to anyone. It's just like a nice time suck for them. So that's also something to keep in mind as these things continue to pop up. It has really not that much to do with whether they think it's legal or not, because they really know it's not.
Yeah, and it makes activists' lives very difficult, which is one of the prime motives. And this even goes for people that are threatening to the system that probably didn't even consider themselves activists before, like Lenny Bruce. I mean, he was saying things about the government and about religion that were upsetting to the powers that be, and so they just arrested him for his speech, for things he was saying on stage, so much so that he was spent all of his time dealing with lawsuits, trying not to go to prison for things he had said for his speech, and it ultimately killed him. I mean, he became so stressed and screwed up and unable to make a living that he ultimately OD'd on drugs. But I think that they figured whether they get him into jail or not, at least they're making his life difficult. He's not able to tour. He's not able to say the things he wants to say.
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of a far more extreme scenario of stopping activists, we'll get to Fred Hampton in a second here, but I just wanted to say thank you guys for listening and for making this show exist. That we have no ads or commercials or sponsors or anything except for our own stuff, and so if you want to keep this show going, if you want to keep Common Censored going, please go to patreon.com/Common Censored and just become a patron at any level. You'll get extra content, and you'll be making alternative media awesome again. Making it great again. So that's patreon.com/Common Censored. All of Eleanor's stuff, including writing and videos, is at artkillingapathy.com. My new book is out for pre-sales, and this is a new announcement that I just found out about. There are a limited number of hard copy versions, signed.
Fancy.
Yeah, signed hard copy. Not signed by me, just some guy they found on the street. But no, signed by me, the hard copy version, and you can get the paperback version signed as well. I think that's an option on that's on the U.S. website because of shipping. They don't have it on the U.K. website, I think. But anyway, that's all at leecampbook.com. Forward by Chris Hedges, intro by Jimmy Dore. Check it out. Live shows coming up: Austin, Dallas, Philadelphia. Eleanor will be opening in Philadelphia. We're adding more cities soon. Of course, Washington, D.C. I'm always taping here, and it's free to come to that. But it's all at redactedtour.com, or you can get it on my website, leecamp.com. Let's see. Shoot us emails, commoncensored@protonmail.com if you want us to cover topics or let us know about anything. And let's keep going. So if trying to force you into court and arrest you on various other things is apparently not enough to stop you, then at least back in the 60s and 70s, they would just assassinate you. So Fred Hampton, who was a chairman of the Black Panthers, and he was only 21 years of age. It's been 50 years now. On December 4th, it was 50 years since he was murdered in his home in Chicago, I believe. And some 90-some bullets were shot by the police at Fred Hampton, and they killed him, and then they claimed they were defending themselves, even though I think something like 90 bullets fired at him, and I think they found one bullet that they claim was fired towards the police. And this is a 21-year-old Black Panther. And although I know we've said it before, Eleanor, do you want to talk a little bit about what the Black Panthers actually did? Because I feel like there's so much bullshit and so much like intentionally created falsehoods about the Black Panthers. Sometimes we need to remind people what they actually did.
Yeah, so the Black Panther Party was started by Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton in Oakland, California. And basically they were two guys that felt that they needed to stand up for their community. And they created a 10-point program that was largely based on a lot of socialist and communist ideas. They were heavily influenced by the revolution in Cuba and China and, of course, Marxist theory. But they also decided that this was not something that they could just pull from history, right? Because nobody's place in time is anybody else's. And so they based their 10-point platform on their place and time, Oakland in that era. And so basically the Black Panther Party was about Black power, which a lot of people have construed to mean that it was racist against white people, but that is absolutely not the case. And in fact, a lot of Black Panthers from, the more public figures such as Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, and Fred Hampton talked about this. And in fact, one of Fred Hampton's quotes was, "We don't think you fight fire with fire best. We think you fight fire with water. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight with solidarity." And so that idea was, of course, misconstrued to say that, oh, these Black Panthers are anti-white. Really, they were anti-white supremacy. And
the reason they were so, many of the things you're saying speak to why they were so scary to the ruling elite. But another reason was they were helping the Black community better than the government was in certain areas. They were feeding people. They were helping with daycare and stuff like that.
Yeah, the breakfast program.
And they were defending the Black community. They were in some states they were open carrying, walking around with their own arms. And
in fact, that's where and it was actually called the Black Panther Bill in California. It was passed specifically with regards to the fact that Black Panthers were legally, because the story kind of goes that Huey P. Newton used to always carry around this book where the law was clearly written that you could open carry in Oakland at the time. And then soon after, and they would walk around with rifles. And if a cop, and of course cops did walk up to them, and they wouldn't do anything. They would just observe, and that was the whole point. It was like the original cop watch. They would watch these cops who were really an occupying force in Oakland, just like they still are in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods today. And they would observe, but they would observe with these fucking rifles strapped to their chests.
Well, and this speaks to what open carry and everything really means. What it really means is open carry for white people.
Exactly.
Because in most areas, if you're Black or Hispanic and you're walking around with a gun on your hip, you're kind of taking your life into your own hands, that the cops aren't just going to show up and start shooting. So all these right-wingers who just say they want to defend open carry, well, really, they want open carry for white people.
Exactly. And so the Black Panthers really, as you noted, Lee, they were a threat to the ruling elite. And one of the biggest ways wasn't that they had guns. That was just what the propaganda, once again, the dangerous Black, predominantly man, the dangerous Black man who's just like this wild beast that's going to come rape your white women or whatever the fuck, like it was this kind of propagandized picture that they used. But in reality, the real threat was the fact that they were not only helping the communities with these breakfast programs and things like that, but they were educating the community on the community's power to fight back and to, kind of like this idea of organizing in the workplace. It's like once people realize that they are the ones that have the power to defend themselves and to take on their government, well, shit, that makes governments really uncomfortable, particularly if that's a white supremacist government.
So, for these reasons, our government decided they needed to bring down the Black Panthers, and they did it in a variety of means. Some of them were arrested and locked up for years. Some of them were locked up for 30 or 40 years, many of them in solitary confinement. But around the same time that Fred Hampton was assassinated with these 90 bullets fired by cops into his home, they apparently hit like 26 other chapters around the U.S. with various things, sometimes actually firing on them, but most of the time arresting them and, for false charges or trumped up charges or whatever. But, by the end of a few months later, much of the Black Panthers had been just destroyed because our government had decided that it was time to lock them up or kill them.
Well, and this also dovetails into COINTELPRO, which is one of the things that really pushed Huey P. Newton over the edge was these infiltration tactics where the FBI would infiltrate these organizations. They did it to the anti-war movement as well. This idea that you didn't know who you could trust. And so there became a lot of paranoia, justified, obviously, because there really were infiltrators.
Right.
But this breaks, and we see this today too, it breaks apart movements because people don't know who to trust. They start fighting amongst themselves. And things just kind of fizzle and die. So that's another big point that really pulled apart the Black Panther Party and, of course, the anti-war movement during the 60s.
That's why I have intense hazing for anyone I'm going to trust. There's a long paddling of the ass ceremony. So I just figure that cops probably won't want to go through that. So.
Well, I feel like they would, because I feel like most of them are probably frat boys anyway, and so that's like a thing that they do. I feel like that's just something cops do anyway, because it's like, I feel like it's very homoerotic, but they're not allowed to admit that it is, so...
Well, speaking of that, I think they did like having the nightsticks hanging from the hip. I think they're probably kind of sad that they don't have that anymore. But.
And not so fun fact, nothing to do with nightsticks, but... Not so fun fact.
Man.
The SWAT team, as the kind that went to Max's house and pulled him out of his home, the SWAT team was actually created because of the Black Panthers. And the first place that they were used was Los Angeles, the LAPD SWAT team against the Black Panther Party. So the SWAT team was created specifically to fight an organization that wanted autonomy and that was staunchly anti-racist. So there you go.
I did not know that, but I do remember that recently, like in the past 10 to 15 years, the use of SWAT teams has shot up dramatically because it used to be that they would largely only be used in extreme circumstances. And now all these police departments around the country, they have the weapons of war that have been passed down from the Pentagon, and they want a chance to use them. So now they send SWAT teams out, because there's like a guy who took a whiz on a lawn or something.
Yeah, it's one of those like smoke 'em if you got 'em situations.
If your only tool is a hammer, then send out the SWAT team.
That's how that saying goes.
That's how the saying goes. So I thought it'd be a good segue after the open carry discussion to talk about this next story.
So this was a story that was posted by News to Share, which is a really good kind of like on the ground news as it's happening organization. And they were down in Dallas recently, where it's illegal to feed the homeless. And this is something that we've seen across the nation. A lot of like Food Not Bombs, that organization, folks might be familiar with them. They are routinely harassed, if not arrested, by cops. Folks might remember that a while back, like there was like a 95-year-old or something that was handcuffed and taken away because he was feeding the homeless in a public park. So
that was Florida. Yeah.
Yeah. So these kind of stories are pretty common around the states. So in Dallas, it's illegal to feed the homeless. So activists wanted to do that. They wanted to feed the homeless and also have a clothing drive.
However, not illegal to feed a dog you see on the street, but
nope.
just a person.
And so what they did, open carry is legal in Texas, of course, because Texas. So what they did is,
of course, because Texas.
They fed the homeless and held a clothing drive with folks open carrying, everything from, handguns to rifles strapped to their back. And lo and behold, the cops did not fuck with them. And so I thought that this was, I saw this story and I thought, well, this is a really interesting story because only in the United States would you need a fucking automatic rifle strapped to your back in order to feed the homeless?
There's people in other countries right now that are truly aghast at this story.
I know.
Not only are there random citizens walking around with massive firearms on their hips, but they're doing it so that they can defend themselves as they feed homeless people.
Right. I know. There's so many layers of what the fuckedness about this story. I don't even know where to start. But it's just so US. Like stranger than fiction.
Well, and it gets to, I posted a stand-up clip recently about how our legal system has been, inverted. It's a morally inverted universe. Like, and this is a perfect example where things that should be illegal are not, such as, or at least not prosecuted, such as, stealing millions of homes during the last housing crisis. Sorry, the bank stealing millions of homes. So that's not really illegal, or at least not prosecuted. And however, it's illegal to feed the homeless. I mean, when you live in a kind of morally inverted legal system like that, it's like, what is...
Well, and
should you abide by the laws?
How about just that earlier story that it's totally legal to pass a law that starves 700,000 people plus like 1 million children, but it's not okay to then feed people who are hungry. Like
right.
That, I mean, that might be perhaps the most stark hypocrisy and like sort of holy shit that I can think of, but yeah, and of course this is, as the saying goes, it is not, it's not moral to follow immoral laws. Slavery was legal. That's one of the examples that gets brought up a lot. Mm-hmm. But then the question becomes like, okay, well, if I'm going to be breaking the law, how can I protect myself? And so this conversation of community defense comes up. And I should also mention that the people that I saw in the video that were open carrying were all white. So that is a point that should be mentioned. But when we talk about this, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to break the law in this obviously nonviolent way, but I want to have a deterrent, which is what they were saying in the video is this is a deterrent. They weren't there to fucking, have a fire show. It was there as a deterrent, and it worked, which begs the question, okay, well, if the only thing that these cops understand is that sort of potential show of force, that potential show of violence, is this a tactic that we should use?
Well, it also is inviting some sort of massacre where the cops show up and instantly pull their guns and, then one of them is a, 21-year-old cop who gets nervous and fires, and then you have people who are trying to feed homeless people getting shot and killed, and it's definitely not ideal.
Well, no, but the whole situation isn't ideal, right? So, I mean, and it's not ideal either that you see people, locked down to equipment that then get beat by cops or pepper sprayed by cops who are just sitting there. None of these situations are ideal. And so then, or, the quote unquote less than lethal ammunition that they fire at protesters. I'm not the only person I know that's almost gotten hit by a fucking concussion grenade. I mean, none of these situations are ideal. So it's an interesting conversation to have. And I know that some people would say, oh, absolutely not. You should never bring guns into a situation like this. Okay, but at what point do we say, look, the only way that I can actually help my community, kind of like in that Black Panther mentality, the only way that I can help my community is to show you that I'm not fucking around. And the only way that I can show you that I'm not fucking around is to literally strap a weapon to my chest.
Yeah. No, I don't know.
I think obviously
I think it invites a scenario where you're all just getting armed to the teeth, and then obviously it ends up in a bloodbath. It doesn't, it ends up in a Fred Hampton scenario.
Well, right. And Fred Hampton, by the way, was just sitting at home. Like, he wasn't even out and about. So I think I think it's important to always think of this tactically. And I've had several of my veteran friends point this out, that activists don't think of things tactically. And that's not oftentimes our fault. I was never trained in the art of warfare. But veteran friends have pointed out that you don't think tactically, but you need to. Not because, oh, this is war, but like this is a battle for our basic human rights. And as such, we have to be thinking tactically, not in terms of violence, but in terms of what we have at our disposal. Okay, what do we have? We've got lock boxes, and we've got tree sits, and we've got monopods, and we've got et cetera, et cetera. But why should we not look at things like open carry? Why should we not look at things that are also available to us that, yes, do escalate a situation, but do so potentially in a deterrent way, and also create these conversations that we're having now? This idea that at what point do we say, you know what, I can't just let you keep arresting us for trying to feed hungry people. Like something's got to give. So yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting conversation that should be had in every community, and it should change based on the situation. I'm not saying that everybody should always go out to a protest with a fucking Uzi strapped to their backs. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. But I think this is a conversation that needs to be had in all of our community groups and in our movement spaces.
I mean, I think people should just be open carrying like meatloaf on their belts, and they should just, to feed the homeless. So
you're a vegetarian.
I'll just open carry some. That's true. Fake meatloaf.
A
tofurkey. Open carry tofurkey on their belts.
That sounds disgusting.
Because it serves two purposes. One is you can feed the homeless at the drop of a hat, because you got it right there on the hip. You get good at pulling it out quickly. But then also it probably would keep back most of the meat eaters, because they'd be like, oh, tofurkey. So.
Oh, but you want to bring the meat eaters in and be like, hey, tofurkey's actually pretty good if you cook the shit out of it with a variety of spices. But I think I'll see your tofurkey and I'll raise you a deer, because I think the element of surprise should not be cast aside here. And I think if you showed up a la Robin Hood, in the green tights and everything, with a deer like wrapped around your back, I think just the element of surprise there is going to...
What are you doing with the deer? Are you feeding it to people?
Yeah, I guess. Or it's a prop. I don't know. Whatever.
It's a prop.
I haven't...
Or just as a prop.
I'm spitballing here, but
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Slinging deer at people.
I'm slinging... Yeah. You never know.
All right. Well, I'll go collect some roadkill so I don't have to kill the deer. I'll just find a deceased deer who wants to ride on my back.
See, there you go. Waste not, want not.
So moving on to our next topic. I know we talked about COP25 last week, but there's some new information about one of the main displays, center kiosks or whatever, that display areas within COP25 is the largest carbon emitter in all of Spain.
Yeah, so this reminds me, so back in
Endesa.
Back in 2018, there was an international climate change conference in Poland. Folks might remember this. It was actually another COP. It was COP24. So this is, again, as
what
I
does COP stand for again? It doesn't stand for COPs. I know that.
No, it's the Conference of Parties, the UN Climate Change Conference of Parties. So basically, and I call it the COP out, because it does fucking nothing with regards to climate change. But this is par of the course for the COP meetings. So last year it was in Poland. And Poland literally filled the COP halls with coal. I'm not fucking kidding. I reported on this last year. No. No, they're super fucking proud of it. They filled it. No, first of all, they picked coal companies to sponsor the talks. And then they decked the halls of the exhibition center with piles of coal. And they were dead fucking serious. You can look it up. There are pictures of the exhibition hall, and literally they're like these cages of coal, and then there are like little trinkets that are made out of coal, which you can also find like in West Virginia rest stops if you go. It's like little baby Jesus made out of coal. But like they were dead serious.
I could see like filling the halls of like one of these conferences with coal as like a fuck you, like activists filling it with coal and being like, this is what you've done.
Nope. Oh, and then there was also a procession through the town of the coal miners band, and there was a patron saint of coal that they have. I swear to God, I'm not making this up.
So it sounds like things have not gotten better, because this is like Spain's largest emitter, carbon emitter, Endesa, donated $2.2 million to the COP25 summit.
Yeah, and
so their signs are like everywhere.
Yeah, and so basically they're the largest electric utility provider in Spain, as well as the country's biggest corporate greenhouse gas polluter, emitting somewhat close to 60 million tons of carbon every year. And they are one of the biggest sponsors of COP25 in Madrid. So they, as you noted, they donated $2.2 million. So they're a diamond sponsor of the conference, which basically means that they get a large exhibition space, kind of like the coal people, in the conference stakeholders area. So, and then on top of that, they've got like these huge front page ads in all of the Spanish newspapers.
Probably saying things like, we're going to fix the environment. We're green.
Right. Well, yeah, and it's basically like, you know, it's like clean coal versus, you know, BP says that they're doing like oil, algae and shit. It's like
oh yeah, they kept saying beyond petroleum was BP's thing.
Yeah.
And not so much.
No, just petroleum, really. So yeah, this is another one of like we mentioned last week before Lee, you found this specific story. This is the MO for the COP meetings.
And so I just wanted to give a shout out to what I thought was at least a somewhat more positive action. We've talked before about Extinction Rebellion. There are some things, you know, they've done that I think can be criticized, definitely. But I think anytime you end up with a large movement, you're going to have a lot of criticisms to go around. There were tons of criticisms of Occupy, and many of them justified, some of them not justified. But I don't think that's that unusual. But anyway, Extinction Rebellion here in D.C. This a couple of days ago, or yesterday or something, 2 days ago, blocked and shut down many of the financial institutions that are most involved in funding and backing fossil fuels, including the World Bank offices that are here in DC. So.
That's great, yeah.
But those are better targets for protest than like as you say, sitting out in front of the White House and taking a photo.
Yeah, I'm really not a fan of the White House protests, but that's story time for a different time. Folks can talk to me after class.
So let's move on to NAFTA.
Yeah, so it's the artist formerly known as NAFTA. It's now
they've changed it to a symbol so that we can't discuss it anymore.
Which is part of this, and I know, Lee, you've talked about this before, like the banality of evil, and how they name things. Like this one's it's now called the U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement, this trade deal, which is basically NAFTA 2.0. And so they make it sound really boring, and they change the name.
Well, I actually think that a large part of the reason they're even doing this is just because Trump is not very bright, but he's got promotion intelligence. So he knew when he was running for office that NAFTA is very unpopular. And so he ran around saying, essentially, I'm only slightly paraphrasing, these fucking idiots with their NAFTA, they have no idea what they're doing. They hurt American jobs. NAFTA was a terrible deal, terrible deal, terrible deal, terrible deal. And, most of his sentences have 2 to 3 words. And he had to, when he got into office, because he'd said all that shit, he had to quote unquote renegotiate NAFTA. And so now they're coming out with their new version, which from what I've heard, although I think it's incredibly secretive like TPP was and like all of these are, from what I've heard, it's pretty similar to NAFTA.
It is. It's basically NAFTA 2.0, and some people have said, "Oh, well, there are some, there are some things that are different than NAFTA that make it better." Yeah, but no, because if you look at the specifics. Like one of the things are these corporate boards, or these sorry, what do you call it? Corporate judges, these corporate courts.
Oh, the tribunals.
The tribunals. Thank you. Gosh, I was really struggling for that word. These corporate tribunals that are not beholden to a country. They are the ones responsible for suing the country for potential profits that are lost if that country tries to, for instance, pass laws that protect the people or their ecosystems from corporate malfeasance. Then the corporation
right. So this is supposedly an international tribunal of judges, but these judges are basically decided by corporate interests. So these are like corporate judges deciding these things.
Right. And so some people have pointed out, oh, well, there's, they're going to pull back those corporate tribunals, and that's really great. But if you read the fine print in the USMCA, they're not going to, not for anything, not for the next, there's going to be a gradual phase out of those corporate tribunals for certain issues. But for the larger majority of industries and issues, they're not going to phase out those corporate tribunals at all. So again, it's kind of like this flowery, hey, we're going to get rid of the corporate tribunals on some things in fucking 2 decades. So it's this sort of fine print shit that we really have to look at. And with regards to environmental destruction, intellectual property, jobs, everything is just a re-upping of NAFTA. So things have started moving forward, and a lot of outlets have, the New York Times, a lot of outlets have basically said we're getting closer. Mexico has said that they feel confident that they're getting closer to signing a deal. And this is fucking awful news. It's awful news for the environment, because not just because of what I said with regards to these corporate tribunals, but also just because of the regulations that sort of get slashed on behalf of keeping, quote unquote, the free market open across these borders, which again, borders don't matter for corporations. They only matter for refugees.
Right. And you got to remember who's fucking writing these things.
Yeah.
Who writes any of these trade deals? The good news is it's not Donald Trump, because he's not going to fucking sit down and write 1,000 pages of trade deal. No. The bad news is it's not Donald Trump. It's fucking corporate judges, not judges, but corporate lawyers. They are always the ones that are actually writing this thing. It is never given to the people. It's never given to unions in these decision-making process. And Obama actually said that when he was running for office, because you pull out all the bullshit when you're running for office, and then you don't do any of it. But on the debate stage, and I've played the clip on the show, he was talking about how we needed to renegotiate NAFTA because the unions were not involved in the decision-making process. Yeah, they never are. Yeah. Unions are not, workers are not, the people are not. There's no democracy. It is corporate lawyers and corporate lobbyists that come together and decide basically a grab bag of shit they want to exploit the planet and not have to worry, and I said this last week, about the risk of democracy. They just don't want to have to worry that people will have a vote in these matters.
Yeah, because unions would never vote. You wouldn't vote to send your job to Mexico or Canada. Right. That's not something to be like, yeah, actually, you know what? I'm tired of actually surviving. That's kind of boring. So, I mean, of course, and another thing that's important to note about USMCA, because of course things like Facebook weren't around when NAFTA was originally signed, is that things like Facebook and other internet giants are going to be harder to regulate because of the USMCA. So, these sort of the ideas that are being put forward by folks like, and I'm not saying I like them, but Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders with regards to breaking up these internet monopolies, the USMCA and other trade deals like it would stand in the way of that, because they supersede domestic law. So even if you tried to break these up, then Facebook could say, well, that's fucking with our profit. That's fucking with our right as a corporation.
Well, and so that's part of what they want, is to put these things in stone so that if a Bernie Sanders were to get into office, these corporations wouldn't have to worry about that they're not going to get their profits. They're going to be split up. They're not going to be able to exploit the resources. And again, that's just to get around democracy.
Yeah. So, and this is something that hasn't been really talked about, and it's so important that we talk about it and get this out there, because in fact, people might remember the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and some have said, oh yeah, well, Trump said no to that when he came into office. Fuck that. It was already dead, because of the work of activists on the ground who'd worked tirelessly for years, spreading the word about how vicious and horrific the TPP was. And so this is the kind of ire that we need to reboot with regards to the USMCA.
Yeah, and just what I said earlier happened between Trump and NAFTA, him talking about how stupid it was, so he therefore needed to renegotiate it when he got into office, whether he knew what was in it or not. Similar thing with TPP. He knew that it was popular to say TPP was a terrible deal, even though not only had Trump not read it, but most of America hadn't seen any of it. Most of what we ultimately did get to see of TPP, we got through WikiLeaks, which is yet another reason that Julian Assange has been locked away for years, because he was revealing the trade deals. And like you said, thanks to activists, thanks to the exceedingly hard work of people like, again, Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers, who were on the TPP beat for years and years, people found out what it was. They started criticizing it. Trump knew that it'd be good for votes to say that TPP was a disaster, and that's what he did. And then when he got into office, he canceled it. Not because he knew anything about it, really, or not because he didn't want to help corporations, which obviously everything he's done has been for the benefit of corporations. When it's been between them and someone else, he's going to side with big corporate interests. No, he did it because that's where the votes were. So he said those things and then carried them out.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, that is our show. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. Please, if you think you got $1 worth from this episode, which I think I did. I think I got $1 worth. Go over to patreon.com/commoncensored. Help us out. Help keep the show going. All Eleanor stuff is at artkillingapathy.com. My stuff, including my new book, is at leecamp.com. And follow us on Twitter, at leecamp, at activist Eleanor. What else we got?
Yeah. That's
all right,
all power to the people, in the words of the Black Panther Party.
All power to the people. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we will we're headed over to Patreon to do 10 to 15 extra minutes, and we will see you guys next week. Keep fighting.
Act out.